The first time Mama Ebunoloa knelt in the middle of the compound at midnight and lifted her voice to God, her brother-in-law Kazim threw a shoe at her from his window. He missed. Or perhaps God redirected it. The shoe clattered against the zinc fence and landed in the gutter, and Mama Ebunoloa did not even flinch. She simply continued praying, her wrapper tied around her chest, her palms upturned, her eyes closed so tightly that the lines around them deepened into something like scripture. "This woman has lost her mind," Kazim said to his wife Bim the next morning, loud enough to be heard from 3 rooms away. "Completely lost. Talking to her every midnight like a mad woman. Somebody should take her to Yoba Left." Yoba Left. The psychiatric hospital. In Lagos, when you wanted to dismiss a person utterly, you sent them there in conversation. You did not even need to mean it literally. It was enough to say it. Enough to plant the idea of madness around a person like a fence, so that everything they did afterward was viewed from inside it. Mama Ebunoloa heard him. She was not deaf. She was not even surprised. She went back into her room, made her ogi, fed her daughter Tiniola, braided the child's hair for school, and went about her day with the same quiet steadiness that people who have survived very specific kinds of pain tend to carry in their bodies, the way water carries the shape of its container. Her name in full was Ebunoloa Adeyemi Coker, and she had come to live in the Adeyemi family compound in Mushin, Lagos, 12 years ago as a young bride of 22. She had been, and this part everyone in the compound still agreed on, beautiful in that particular way that made older women click their tongues and younger men forget their Yoruba. She had also been quiet, respectful, and diligent, the woman who swept the compound before anyone else was awake, who greeted elders with 2 knees on the floor, who cooked enough to share and shared without being asked. Her husband Damilola had been the good-natured, slightly lazy second son of the Adeyemi family. He had loved her, in his way, imperfectly, intermittently, the way some people love when love has not cost them anything yet. He had given her Tiniola, a girl with her mother's eyes and her father's wide easy smile. And then, 8 years into their marriage, he had died. A bus on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. The kind of death that happened so fast that there was nothing to hold on to afterward, no final words, no warning, just an ordinary Tuesday that ended in a phone call. After Damilola died, the compound showed Ebunoloa who it was. The reading of what little property he had left was a quiet disaster presided over by Damilola's elder brother Tejuddin, who had decided, with the administrative efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, that everything of value belonged to the family. The small shop Damilola had been running. The one plot of land in Ikorodu his father had given him. Even the slightly too old Toyota Camry that had been Damilola's greatest pride. All of it absorbed into the family estate with the smoothness of water absorbing a stone. Ebunoloa was left with her room in the compound, her daughter, her sewing machine, and a monthly widow's allowance that Tejuddin set at an amount that suggested he had calculated the minimum required to avoid guilt. She accepted all of this without litigation, without drama, without the tearful public confrontations that others expected. People mistook her stillness for defeat. They did not know yet what it actually was. It was in the year after Damilola's death that Ebunoloa found God. Or rather, and she would always make this distinction when people asked, God found her. She had not been a woman of deep religious practice before. She went to church on Sundays when it was convenient. She said her prayers at night with the same routine sincerity that most people apply to brushing their teeth. She believed without having been tested. But grief had tested her, and the version of faith that survived the test was a different animal entirely from what had gone in. She began waking at midnight. Not because she set an alarm, but because something woke her, a quality of silence that felt inhabited, the sense of a presence in her room that was too large for the room and yet entirely comfortable there. She began to pray, first in whispers, then, as weeks passed and the prayers became conversations, in a fuller voice. And when the room felt insufficient, when the prayers needed more space, she took them to the compound. This was when the trouble began. A compound in Mushin is not a private place. It is a small city of overlapping lives, 17 rooms, 4 families, 1 boho, 2 bathrooms, and the particular economy of people who know each other's business by proximity alone. There is no such thing as a private act in a compound. Everything is witnessed. Everything is discussed, and a widow kneeling in the center of it at midnight, talking aloud to an invisible God, was the kind of thing that a compound could not leave alone. Before we go any further, I want to stop here and ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. Whether you're in Lagos or London, Accra or Atlanta, let me know. Now let's continue with Mama Ebunoloa. Bimp, Kazim's wife, a woman whose primary talent was the conversion of information into opinion, became the unofficial spokesperson of the compound's concerns. She held court each morning by the borehole with the authority of someone who had been elected to a position that did not exist. That woman prays every night like she is calling God on a phone line, Bimp announced one morning while filling her bucket. She must have done something terrible and she is trying to wash it away. Nobody asked Bimp what she thought. Nobody needed to. She told them anyway. Tajuddin's wife Mama Remy, who was older and therefore conducted her disdain with more decorum, simply said, grief has entered her head. God does not need to be disturbed at midnight. He is not your neighbor to knock on his door at any hour. This was delivered with the finality of a woman who had settled the theology of the matter and would not be revisited. The children of the compound were more direct. Tiniola, Ebunoloa's daughter, came home from school one afternoon with a face that had been carefully arranged to show nothing, which meant that something had happened. When her mother pressed, she said, "They said you are the compound mad woman." Ace had said her mother said you talk to yourself every night. Ebunoloa sat with her daughter and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think?" Tiniola said, "I think you talk to God." And Ebunoloa said, "Then you think correctly. Come and eat." Tiniola was 9 years old and had her mother's exactness. She had watched her mother lose a husband and a life stability and rebuild both from a sewing machine and prayer, and she had drawn from this a conclusion that would serve her well for the rest of her days, that the people who called you mad were usually afraid of something you had that they didn't. The praying continued. Ebunoloa prayed for the compound. She prayed for Kazim, who did not deserve it and did not know it was happening. She prayed for Bimp, whose tongue was sharp because her marriage was unhappy, a fact that Ebunoloa understood without being told. She prayed for Tajuddin, who had taken everything that was hers and would one day have to account for it to someone larger than a magistrate. She prayed for her daughter, with the specific ferocity that mothers apply to prayers for their children, the kind of prayer that does not politely request but grabs heaven by the collar. And she prayed for herself, not for things, not for money or comfort or revenge, but for clarity. For the ability to see clearly what she was supposed to do next. It was during this season of praying for clarity that she began to sow. She had always sown for money, school uniforms, simple dresses, the occasional osoebi for parties. But something shifted. Her fingers began to do things she had not planned. She started cutting and combining in ways that surprised her, pulling fabrics together that had no business being together and discovering that the combination was extraordinary. A client came for a burial gown and left with something that people at the funeral kept asking about. Another came for an Ankara skirt and left with a piece so striking that photographs of it appeared on a Lagos lifestyle blog the following week. Word moved through Lagos the way words do, sideways, through hairdressers and church sisters and the women who delivered fabric at Balogun Market. More clients came. Better clients. Women who arrived in cars and left their numbers and returned with friends. Ebunoloa raised her prices twice in 6 months without losing a single customer. She hired 2 girls from the neighborhood to help with the simpler work. She moved her sewing operation from the bedroom into the small veranda outside her room, then negotiated with Tajuddin, without sentiment, with paperwork, to rent the unused room adjacent to hers as a proper workspace. The compound noticed. The compound had no choice but to notice. The cars that began stopping at the gate were too nice to ignore. The women who stepped out of them, their lace and their jewelry catching the afternoon light, were too obviously successful to dismiss. Bimp watched from her window with an expression that she was trying to pass off as indifference and failing completely. Kazim said to his wife one evening, "Where is all this coming from?" And Bimp, for once in her life, did not have an answer. Mama Remy, to her credit, said nothing negative. She simply began returning Ebunoloa's morning greetings with a slightly more thorough response than before. This was, in compound language, the equivalent of an apology. Ebunoloa still prayed at midnight. The praying had not produced the business, the business had grown from the praying. This was an important distinction that she maintained privately and did not labor to explain to anyone. The praying was not a transaction. It was a relationship. And like all real relationships, it had changed her from the inside in ways that simply expressed themselves on the outside as different choices, different confidence, different eyes. The night that everything changed was a Thursday in October, the kind of Lagos night that cannot decide whether to rain or simply threaten. The air was heavy and charged, and the compound had been disagreeable all day. The boho had stopped working in the morning, a child had broken a neighbor's pot and the mother had been blamed, and the blame had spread and widened like oil on water until 4 separate arguments were happening simultaneously by evening. By 9 o'clock the compound had settled into a tired, irritable silence. At midnight, Ebunoloa came to the compound. She had been praying in her room fast, as she often did, but tonight the prayer had a different weight to it, an urgency she didn't fully understand. She had been praying, for 3 weeks, about one specific thing: Tiniola's secondary school fees. The business was growing, but it had not yet grown fast enough. Tiniola had been offered admission to Federal Government Girls' College in Akure, a thing Ebunoloa had prayed for specifically, by name, years ago when people told her that a compound child with a seamstress mother had no business aiming that high. The admission had arrived. The fees were another matter. The amount was not enormous by Lagos standards of the wealthy. For a widow running a 3-year-old business out of a compound in Mushin, it was exactly the distance between possible and impossible. She had not told anyone. This was not stubbornness, it was theology. She had taken it to God first, and she had not yet received an instruction to take it anywhere else. So she knelt in the compound, under the low and threatening sky, and she prayed. She prayed loudly. Perhaps the weight of it required loudness. Perhaps 3 weeks of patient praying had reached a point where patience needed to become urgency. She prayed in Yoruba and in English and in the wordless language that comes when language runs out, which some people call tongues and others call grief and others call the place past words where everything true lives. I want to pause here and ask you again, drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. Are you going through something like Mama Ebunoloa right now, trusting God in a season that looks impossible? Write it in the comments, you are not alone. Now let's see what happened next. The compound woke up. Not all at once, but progressively, window by window, the way a theater feels before a performance. Kazim woke first and muttered something that his wife heard and pretended not to. Bimp, predictably, sat up in bed with the alertness of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this disturbance. Mama Remy woke because she was old and old people do not sleep deeply, and old people in compounds are always alert to sounds that break pattern. And then, this was the part nobody expected, Tiniola came out. She was in her nightgown, 12 years old, and she walked to where her mother was kneeling and she knelt beside her. She did not pray loudly. But she knelt, and she closed her eyes, and anyone watching could see that she was not performing. She was a child who believed what she had seen, and what she had seen was her mother's life, and her mother's life was evidence. It was while they were praying, mother and daughter, in the compound, witnessed by the irritable and the skeptical and the formerly shoe-throwing, that a car entered the street outside. It was not an unusual hour for cars in Lagos. Lagos does not have unusual hours. But this car slowed at the compound gate, and the horn sounded in a particular pattern, 3 short, 1 long, that made Ebunoloa open her eyes. She knew that horn. She had not heard it in 4 years. The gate opened. The car that came through was a white Toyota Prado, and the woman who stepped out of it was Hejia Ramota Adebisiu Yeloran, who had been Ebunoloa's mother's closest friend before her mother died, who had attended Ebunoloa's wedding and wept with more feeling than the bride's own aunties, and who had lost touch with Ebunoloa in the chaos of bereavement and compound politics and the general way that Lagos swallows people whole if they don't fight actively to hold on to each other. Hejia Ramota was 61 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided, somewhere in her 50s, that she no longer had time for anything less than direct. She stepped out of the car and looked at Ebunoloa kneeling in the compound and said, "There you are. I have been looking for you for 2 years." The compound had, by this point, entirely abandoned the pretense of sleep. Bimp was in her doorway. Kazim was behind her. Mama Remy had brought out a chair, which was how you knew she intended to stay. 3 other families had representatives present. Nobody spoke. They were all watching Hagia Remota walk across the compound to the kneeling woman and hold out her hands. "Get up, my daughter," Hagia Remota said. "God told me to come and find you. I did not know why until just now." Egbunoluwa stood. Tiniola stood beside her, still quiet, still watching. "I have been trying to locate you since your husband's burial," Hagia said. "Nobody could give me your number. I asked your husband's family and they gave me wrong information, whether by accident or intention, God knows. But 3 weeks ago I had a dream, and in the dream I was told, she is in Mushin, find the compound." She paused. "I have tried 4 compounds in Mushin in the past 3 weeks. Tonight I tried this one." Egbunoluwa looked at her. 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. 3 weeks ago was the night Egbunoluwa had started praying specifically about Tiniola's school fees. She did not say this to the compound. But the compound was watching. The compound was watching a woman who they had called mad standing in the middle of their courtyard at midnight, and a woman of obvious wealth and standing had driven through their gate and said she had been sent. Bimp, in her doorway, was very still. Hagia Remota asked to speak privately, and they went inside. Tiniola made tea with the authority of a child who had learned that hospitality was not optional. What passed between the 2 women in that room was not witnessed by the compound, but its results were Hagia Remota had been, in her working years, a fabric importer. She had retired, but she had not been idle in retirement. She had, in fact, spent the past 3 years building something, a fashion cooperative for women in Lagos, a structure to help skilled seamstresses access better materials, better markets, better prices. She had been looking for someone to head the cooperative's design and mentorship arm. Someone with skill and character and the particular quality of leadership that does not come from training but from having carried things. She had, she told Egbunoluwa, been praying about who that person was supposed to be. The cooperative would pay a salary. A real salary, not a compound widow's allowance calculated for minimum guilt. It would also settle Tiniola's school fees as part of Egbunoluwa's employment package, because Hagia Remota ran her organizations the way she ran her life, with the understanding that you cannot get a person's full attention if their child's future is uncertain. Egbunoluwa sat with all of this for a long time after Hagia Remota left, which was nearly 2 in the morning. Tiniola had fallen asleep on the bed behind her, one arm flung over her face in the abandon of a sleeping child. Egbunoluwa sat at her sewing table and looked at her daughter and looked at her hands and looked at the dark window and understood what had happened in a way she did not have words for yet. She had been praying into what felt like silence. The compound had been calling it madness. And all along, on the other side of the silence, preparations were being made. A woman was having a dream. A car was being aimed at Mushin. 4 compounds were being tried. God had been building an answer in the time that Egbunoluwa was building a question, and they had met each other at midnight, in a compound, in front of witnesses. In front of witnesses. This, she would think later, was the part that mattered most. Not for her sake, she had not needed the compound's validation to continue. But because the compound needed to see it. Because Bimp needed to see it. Because Kazim, who had thrown a shoe at a praying widow, needed to see it. Because all the people who had watched her and whispered and rendered verdicts from behind curtains needed to see, with their own eyes, that what they had called madness was conversation, and the conversation had been heard. In the morning, Bimp came to her door. This alone was something that had never happened in the 4 years of their co-residence in the compound. Bimp came to other people's doors to borrow and to gossip and to deliver uninvited observations. She had never come to Egbunoluwa's door for any purpose at all. And yet here she was, with a covered plate, fried eggs and ajit bread, hot, clearly just made, and a face that was doing extraordinary work to remain casual. "I brought breakfast," Bimp said. "For you and Tiniola." Egbunoluwa looked at her for a long, steady moment. Not unkindly, but steadily, in the way of a person who does not need to pretend that history has not happened. "Thank you, Bimp," she said, and took the plate. Bimp stood there for a moment more. "That woman who came last night," she started. "She looked important." "She is," Egbunoluwa said. And she said, Bimp paused, visibly rearranging something internal. She said God sent her. That is what she said. Another pause. Bimp had lived her whole life as a woman of quick words and ready opinions, and right now she was a woman who had run entirely out of both. She looked at the compound around her, the boho, the zinc fence, the narrow corridors of their shared and complicated life, and then she looked at Ebinoloa. Will you pray for me? Bimp said. And because she was Bimp, she added immediately, my husband's business has not been going well. I was not going to say anything, but... Bimp, Ebinoloa said gently. Yes. I will pray for you. Bimp nodded very quickly, the way people nod when they are trying not to cry and are not going to cry and absolutely should not be about to cry over something like this. Good, she said, and went back to her room. Kazim came that evening. He did not bring food. He stood at her door with a look on his face that was partly pride and partly something that had no name except the expression a person wears when they understand they have been wrong for a long time and there is no good way to account for the time. He said, that shoe. He stopped. I owe you an apology for that shoe. Ebinoloa said, it missed. And he almost smiled, and she almost smiled, and they left it there, which was the right place to leave it. Tajudeen was last. This was expected. He was a man whose capacity for public reckoning was limited by the amount of pride he carried, which was considerable. But one Sunday, after church, he appeared at Ebinoloa's workspace, the one he had rented to her with paperwork and no sentiment, and he stood looking at the fabrics on the walls and the work in progress on the table, and he said, you have done well. 3 words, but from Tajudeen they were a full paragraph. Ebinoloa said, God has been faithful. And Tajudeen, who was not a man given to theological concessions, said, yes. I see that he has. Ebinoloa started at Hejia Remoters Cooperative in November. Tiniola went to Federal Government Girls College in Akure in January, wearing a trunk that was fully packed and a blazer that her mother had tailored to fit her perfectly, because some things a mother must do with her own hands. She cried when she dropped her daughter at the school gate, and Tiniola said, Mommy, stop. You're embarrassing me. And Ebinoloa laughed and cried at the same time, which is the specific experience of a parent watching their child walk toward the future they prayed into existence. She still prays at midnight. Not in the compound, she moved, eventually, to a flat in Suralia, which the cooperative job made possible. But wherever she is, midnight is still hers and God's, still the hour when the noise of the day has cleared enough to hear clearly and to speak honestly and to receive whatever needs to be received. The compound in Mushin still stands. People still live there, still share the borehole and the bathrooms and the complicated economy of proximity. And sometimes, when the conversation slows in the evening, one of the women will mention Mama Ebinoloa, and even Bimp, who has not entirely reinvented herself but has genuinely tried, will say something that is not quite praise and not quite testimony but lives in the territory between them. Something like, that woman was not mad. Something like, she knew something we didn't know yet. Something like the beginning of understanding, which is, when you think about it, the best place any of us can hope to arrive. If this story touched something in you today, please share it with someone who needs the reminder that faithfulness in the unseen season always produces fruit in the same one. And drop a comment telling me where you watched from. Your location reminds me that these stories travel, and they land exactly where they are supposed to. God bless you, and I will see you in the next story.